Principal funding for Rights and Wrongs, the Human Rights television series, has been provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Body Shop Foundation, and the Aaron Diamond Foundation. Globalvision presents a new program on the cutting edge of change. This week, Kosovo, the next flashpoint in the Balkan crisis that could be bloodier than Bosnia. These images document the Serbian occupation of this once autonomous province and have rarely been seen by the outside world. We'll have a unique video diary from inside Europe's ethnic fault line. This ship made headlines with a horror story about Chinese immigrants and raised questions about who qualifies for political asylum. We'll discuss the issues and some human rights victories. A U.S. federal judge orders the release of HIV-positive Haitian refugees from a U.S. detention camp. And El Salvador takes important new steps towards democracy. In our culture segment, from South Africa, the sounds of Johnny Clegg, a white rock and roller who sings in Zulu. One man, one vote. All this on Rights and Wrongs, the television magazine of human rights. From New York, Charlene Hunter-Galt.
Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, almost overnight, these remote Balkan regions became synonyms for cruelty, destruction, and death. And now, Kosovo, another piece of the former Yugoslavia, a powder keg that could plunge the entire region into an all-out war. As part of our continuing series of reports from Europe's ethnic fault line, we turn to Kosovo. It was there that Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic first began to stir the ardent nationalism that brought him to power. Recently, United States ground troops were stationed near Kosovo's border to deter Serbian aggression. But many observers fear that the horror of ethnic cleansing may soon spread. Filmmaker Ilan Ziv produced this video diary of a crisis in the making.
This innocent-looking field is the mythical heart of Serbian national identity. 600 years ago, in 1389, the field of Kosovo was the site of a bloody battle in which Serbia's army was defeated by Turkish invaders. Kosovo was lost to the Serbs until the 20th century. A monument to this ancient battle looms over the field. I was unable to get close to it because today the monument is also the site of a military base overlooking Kosovo's capital of Pristina. Once again, the Serbs seem ready to fight, and if they do, war in the Balkans will once again threaten much of Europe. Today, Pristina appears deceptively calm. Its picturesque market shows few signs of Serbia's repression of the ethnic Albanians, who make up nearly 90% of Kosovo's 2 million people. But beneath the surface, Kosovo is a ticking time bomb. This documentary film explains why. The film, produced by independent Albanian television in Pristina, tells the story of Serbia's occupation of Kosovo, as it has never been told before. This modern-day battle for Kosovo marked the beginning of the unraveling of what the world now calls the former Yugoslavia. In 1988, Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic inflamed nationalist passions by accusing Kosovo's Albanian majority of planning genocide against its Serbian minority. He demanded that Yugoslavia's constitution be changed and that Kosovo become a part of Serbia. Soon, Kosovo's elected leaders were replaced. The reaction in Kosovo was explosive. Mass demonstrations and work stoppages culminated in early 1989 in a miners' strike. More than 800 miners staged a sit-in, remaining underground for days, protesting the constitutional changes and demanding the removal of the Serbian-installed leadership. The miners' strike galvanized the entire province and became a symbol of the Albanian majority's struggle.
We voted. We chose our representatives, but none of them is on the list. Instead, they put their leaders in. We're the working class, but we have stopped working for 5 days and remained underground. We are hungry and thirsty, and without any change of clothes or contact with our family. They're hungry too, and they don't know where we are. We have decided that we would rather die. We will not give up until those imposed leaders and those who put them in are removed, and until they give us rights equal to the rest of the Yugoslavian people.
The miners were promised that the province's new leaders would resign, so they ended their strike. But as the day's protesters were led out of the mine shaft, the Serbs reneged on their promise and promptly arrested the miners. Meanwhile, in Belgrade, Slobodan Milosevic faced a noisy crowd of thousands and promised to fight what he called Albanian separatist nationalism.
I would like to tell you that we will soon publish all the names of those who have used the people for political goals against Yugoslavia. I guarantee that in the name of the leadership of the Socialist Republic of Serbia.
A few days later, Kosovo was placed under virtual martial law. Ethnic Albanian activists were arrested en masse. An investigating commission of the European Parliament left Pristina unable to carry out its duties because Serbian authorities prevented them from talking to any Albanians. A vicious cycle of repression, violence, and death began when dozens of people were killed by Serbian troops in what Human Rights Watch described as a deliberate massacre. These images were shot on home video outside Pristina's Grand Hotel. While inside the hotel, a delegation from the United States, headed by Senator Robert Dole, held a fact-finding hearing. Thousands of ethnic Albanians have been fired from government and industry and replaced by Serbs. Serbs have been forbidden to sell land to Albanians. In effect, Kosovo's Albanians have been transformed into second-class citizens, living under what Human Rights Watch called a virtual colonial regime. Finally, the studios of Television Pristina, like every other Albanian media outlet, were seized, and rebellious Albanian journalists were arrested.
I'm in the control room of the television station.
These are the last images of independent Albanian television in Kosovo, hidden for years and unseen by the world until now. The specter of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 still haunts these fields. One can almost see the young Serbian soldier who, according to legend, snuck into the Turkish commander's tent and killed him. Although the Battle of Kosovo was already lost, this heroic tale is still studied by every Serbian school child. Today, however, the plain of Kosovo is dotted with Albanian villages. Among them, the village of Dresnoch.
The only contact we have with Serbs is with the police when they stop us to search our tractor. We have no contact with Serbian people whatsoever.
There are hardly any young men left in Dresnoch. Most have fled, fearing forced conscription into the Serbian army. These women complained off-camera of violent raids the military conducts looking for the young men. The children are all boycotting Serbian schools. Instead, they study in private homes or in a mosque. But some students, like this girl, don't study at all, since they lack money to pay the teachers, and because school is far away and risky to get to.
What rights do Albanians have? Albania is not even allowed to go to the street. We have nothing. No television. At best, maybe a bad small radio with a battery, if it works. The men cannot find work. Do you know how many workers are unemployed? Maybe only 15% have jobs. But what about the rest? The Albanians don't even have a speck of rights. You see that bridge? It's not even 50 yards from here. But it's not safe for any Albanian to go there because of the Serbian police.
On the other side of the field of Kosovo lies the village of Gračanica. The Serbs who live here are proud of their monastery, which was built more than 60 years before the Battle of Kosovo. Here, even the local cafe is named after the famous 1389 battle.
Before the last 2 years, many customers came into my cafe. Albanians, gypsies, Turks. I didn't ask, but now it's different.
If we didn't understand Albanian, they would not translate or even repeat it for us. Instead, they said, if you don't like it, go to Serbia.
In the monastery of Gračanica, the walls are painted with ancient frescoes of saints and dramatic renditions of the Battle of Kosovo. Serbs will tell you that for centuries they fought the Turks, determined to avenge their defeat on the Kosovo field. But talking to Serbian nationalists, I couldn't escape the feeling that they're determined to refight their battle once again, and this time to set the score right. When that battle begins, they will find not the Turkish soldiers of their myth, but only Albanian villagers struggling to survive.
Denouncing U.S. policy as outrageous, callous, and reprehensible, federal judge Sterling Johnson ordered what he called a Guantanamo Bay HIV prison camp closed. More than 100 HIV-positive Haitian refugees had been detained there for more than a year. We begin our rights reel this week with U.S. military footage from the Guantanamo camp, footage obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. It was shot at a time when the media weren't allowed into the detention center and shows a military riot unit en route to quell protest by the refugees.
This video was obtained under the Freedom of Information Act by the Center for Constitutional Rights, which filed and won a lawsuit resulting in the closure of the camp. Acting for the Haitians was Michael Ratner, who called it a bittersweet victory.
Because what our government did was leave the Haitians on Guantanamo for 20 months in essentially a detention prison camp where they just got sicker, more and more depressed. Then, because of a U.S. decision not to bring them to the United States because of their being HIV positive, they remain in the world's first HIV prison camp for the 20-month period.
There were frequent complaints about overcrowded conditions and poor medical care.
350 U.S. soldiers guarded the camp. They made periodic SWAT team-like raids into the camp using dogs, guns, nightsticks, middle of the night, overturning everybody's beds, getting them out of the camp, total abuse.
In his opinion, Judge Johnson found, 1, it was illegal to detain the refugees indefinitely. 2, the refugees lacked adequate medical care and legal representation. 3, he rejected the claim that they were in a humanitarian camp, calling it nothing more than an HIV prison camp, and ordered 50 people, most HIV positive, sent to the U.S. for medical treatment.
It was a racial issue for him. He saw right through the government's excuses and was very angry. He said, the question for me is, can you kidnap people on the high seas, put them into a detention camp, and basically keep them there indefinitely without any light at the end of the tunnel forever? And basically what he found was you could not, and he really basically said HIV is not a crime. You cannot criminalize a disease in this country. This is something that should have gone out with the Middle Ages.
For Rights and Wrongs, this is Philip Tomlinson.
When disabled war veterans marched for medical benefits in San Salvador in mid-May, they got a taste of how the Salvadoran military handles protest and conflict. 3 died in this incident, but the good news is that this kind of brutality seems to be the exception now, in a country that is making some progress towards democracy.
¡Juicio y castigo a los represivos de
Maria Mirtala Lopez should know. She is seen here in a confrontation in 1991, when this village was visited by U.S.-trained counterinsurgency troops. She received international recognition for her human rights work as a teenager, when she was also a victim of torture. I come from a very poor peasant family. I saw my family die at the beginning of the war in 1980. I don't remember having childhood or youth. Instead, all my efforts and knowledge were devoted to the Salvadoran people. Thanks to the United Nations brokered peace process, military units like this one are being disbanded. At least 103 officers suspected of human rights violations have been fired, although human rights groups say that there is still a lack of accountability.
One thing remains the same, and that is there's no justice. So looking toward the future, unless the judicial system in El Salvador is totally revamped and totally revised, no one will feel safe. People still feel like if someone commits a murder, there will be no justice.
I have come to the U.S. to inform the people, the Salvadoran community, and the Congress about the peace process in El Salvador. We need support for the development of our country, and that all those millions of dollars given to the war are used for peace, democracy, and social justice.
This is Marcy Lefkowitz for Rights and Wrongs.
Rights and Wrongs welcomes your written comments and suggestions. You can also order a transcript for $5 or a video cassette for $24.95 by writing to the Global Center, P.O. Box 311, Radio City Station, New York, New York 10101. Send checks or money orders only. Credit card holders call 1-800-541-2535.
When this ship, the Golden Venture, ran aground on a New York beach carrying hundreds of illegal Chinese aliens, U.S. immigration policy once again became front-page news. The harrowing experience of the Chinese immigrants has reopened the debate over the issue of political asylum and the rights of the tired, hungry, and poor who come seeking refuge in America. Joining me now is Arthur Helton, a refugee specialist of the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. Mr. Helton, thank you for joining us. Everyone agrees, and we've just seen how broken the system really is. But is it in need of major or minor repairs? How do you go about fixing it?
I think major repairs in the following sense. It is now in an institutional home that is probably not the most appropriate place for the asylum responsibility to be located, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. INS is a law enforcement agency. It is dedicated to enforcing immigration law, to ensuring that those who are not authorized to remain in the United States are removed, if necessary, from the United States. And those responsibilities are to some extent incompatible with the humanitarian responsibilities of recognizing genuine refugees in flight from persecution.
So we need a whole nother institution, is it?
We really probably do. Another office within the Department of Justice separated from those enforcement priorities. Beyond that, we have to take it seriously. We have not given sufficient resources to this particular function in order to ensure that cases can be decided fairly and expeditiously.
Well, how big is the problem today? Because with all of these headlines in the newspapers of the more dramatic cases we've seen recently, like the Chinese and the Haitians, there is a general sense that our borders are under siege.
It is a problem, but this has been a sustained problem. We've received upwards of 100,000 asylum claims for the past 3 years, yet we haven't yet organized a system that's capable of deciding those claims in a reasonable period of time. What happens then is that those with spurious claims can make them and essentially gain indefinite permission to stay in the United States while their cases are pending, and that penalizes genuine refugees who would like to win status, bring their family from abroad, sometimes in very dangerous circumstances. We need major reform.
How do you go about achieving major reform and protecting the people who have a well-grounded fear of persecution from those who either have frivolous claims or claims that have nothing to do with politics?
That is exactly the question that I wish senior administration officials were asking themselves. Instead, they tend to think in terms of enhancing law enforcement tools, prerogatives, search and seizure measures, wiretaps, cracking down on smuggling, looking at terrorism, looking at drug interdiction. In fact, what there is a small group of people who move irregularly and in a clandestine way and present themselves to our authorities and request asylum. We have to remain open to that small group of genuine refugees, and what we need to do in order to ensure that they will have a fair chance to gain protection is to provide additional resources. We need to streamline the process, create greater efficiencies. The Immigration and Naturalization Service is a notoriously poorly managed agency. It should be taken out of INS, organized in a new office, and we should get serious.
What kind of money are we talking about? What's being spent now and what needs to be spent in your view?
Only a few $1 million are currently spent on the Asylum Corps of 150 asylum adjudicators in INS. There's a backlog at this point of over 250,000 cases, and that's being added to as we speak now. We simply do not have a system that's capable of keeping up with current receipts. We do little in terms of control, we do little in terms of compassion. We have a non-system that requires reform.
There were editorials when the Chinese landed in the Golden Venture calling for stricter standards of proof. You took exception to that in the New York Times in a letter to the editor.
I did, because I don't think that really is the issue. If you look at those who are presenting themselves for asylum in the United States, many are from Central America, having walked across our southwest border. Some are Haitians and others who've come by boat. Some have come by plane from particularly Africa or the Near East or South Asia and presented themselves at our airports, notably New York. These are relatively small numbers, however. We shouldn't be looking to enhance the standards of proof, in effect depriving refugees of their rights to access to protection, but rather we should be looking to create a system with sufficient resources and sufficient compassion so that cases can be decided in a reasonable period of time and fairly.
But what I think I hear you saying is that we're not, the teeming masses yearning to breathe free are not straining our resources, not threatening our system, not presenting a major problem in and of themselves.
Well, not in the sense that it's being discussed in the public at the moment. We've had a sustained arrival of 100,000 or so asylum applicants over the past 3 years. We had 3,440 Chinese present asylum claims in 1992. Those are the kinds of numbers that do not threaten the life of our nation, but it is a serious issue, and we should be serious about streamlining and introducing greater discipline into the process, but not at the expense of genuine refugees.
Well, Mr. Helton, thank you.
Thank you, Shirley.
You are watching Rights and Wrongs, Human Rights Television. Each week at this time, news and global perspectives you don't see elsewhere.
As we reported last week, the World Conference on Human Rights is now underway in Vienna. To date, it has been as controversial as predicted. We have this report from Steve Anderson.
As expected, the Vienna Conference opened amid controversy, bringing together the conflicting interests of many world leaders and human rights advocates, including former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who was himself a target of protesters.
Well, it's inevitable that when you bring together 150 nations and both their governments and the private citizens and the non-governmental groups, that it's going to be controversial. In fact, within every country, including the United States, the issue of human rights is controversial. So it was inevitable, and I think it would be healthy to have some of these differences come forward.
Main challenge, how to get the industrialized and developing nations to agree on what constitutes human rights.
Because we need both security and subsistence, we need freedom and food. We want these basic rights to be available to everyone, no matter where they live, what color they are, or what they believe in.
Thank you for joining us. I'll be in Vienna and we'll have a final report on the conference for you next week. We close our show with the music of an artist who celebrates democratic rights and free expression. After months of negotiations and decades of oppression and struggle, South Africa recently set an April 1994 date for its first free and fair election, one in which all South Africans will be allowed to vote regardless of their color. In this week's culture segment, activist and musician Johnny Clegg calls out in English and in Zulu for one man, one vote.
Papeti